For 30 years, the world had a joke ready every single time his face was mentioned. He's turning himself white. He hates being black. He's ashamed of who he is. Magazines built entire covers on it. Comedians built entire careers on it. But there was a diagnosis behind that face, a real one. Documented by doctors, confirmed by autopsy, and hidden by a man who was too proud, too hurt, and too afraid to ever fully explain it while he was alive. This is the story of how a skin disease turned the most famous face on the planet into a punchline, and how Michael Jackson spent 3 decades paying the price for a condition he never chose. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button because this story goes deeper than anything you've heard before. The first signs. Let's go back to the early 1980s. Michael Jackson was still the boy from Gary, Indiana, who had grown into the king of pop, with unmistakably brown skin and a face the entire world could recognize instantly. Nobody was talking about his complexion. Nobody had a reason to. Then, quietly, something began to change. Small patches of lighter skin started appearing on his hands, then his face, then his chest. At first it looked minor, the kind of thing a person could hide under makeup for a photo shoot or a concert. Michael tried exactly that. He started wearing heavier foundation, adjusting lighting on stage, choosing gloves and long sleeves as part of his signature look, not entirely for fashion, but partly for cover. Behind the scenes, doctors were already giving him an explanation. It was vitiligo, an autoimmune condition where the body's own immune system attacks the cells responsible for skin pigment. It's not contagious, it's not caused by lifestyle, and there is no cure. It simply spreads, unevenly and unpredictably, leaving blotches of skin with no color at all. For most people diagnosed with vitiligo, the disease is a private medical matter. For Michael Jackson, it became a decades-long public trial, because nobody outside his inner circle knew the truth yet, and the tabloids were not willing to wait for one. The public turns. Here's the detail that makes this story so cruel. Michael didn't hide his skin because he was ashamed of being black. He hid it because the blotching made him look, in his own words, uneven and sick. And he was terrified of how the public would react if photographers caught the patches mid-transition, half brown and half white, before makeup could smooth it into something consistent on camera. But the public didn't get an explanation. They got a mystery, and mysteries about Michael Jackson always turned into headlines. By the mid-1980s, journalists began openly speculating that he was bleaching his skin deliberately. The rumor spread so far that it became accepted as fact in pop culture, repeated in interviews, printed in magazine profiles, and eventually baked into how an entire generation remembered him. What almost nobody reported at the time was that Michael had already, privately, told people close to him about the diagnosis. His dermatologist, Dr. Arnold Klein, would later confirm publicly that he had been treating Michael for vitiligo since the early 1980s, using topical treatments and cosmetic procedures to even out his skin tone rather than lighten it by choice. But medical confirmation rarely travels as fast as a good rumor, and by the time the truth started circulating in interviews, the joke had already become permanent in the culture. The media's role. It's worth stopping here and asking a simple question. How does a documented medical condition lose a 30-year argument against a rumor? The answer is that the tabloid economy of the 1980s and 90s wasn't built to reward accuracy, it was built to reward attention. A headline that said, "Star has rare autoimmune disorder," simply didn't sell the way "Jacko wants to be white" did. Editors knew this. Photographers knew this. Entire magazines built their business model around catching Michael in unflattering light, quite literally, chasing him with cameras designed to expose the very patches he spent hours each morning trying to conceal. Late-night television didn't help either. Jokes about his changing appearance became a reliable punchline for over a decade, repeated so often that audiences stopped questioning whether the premise was even true. Nobody paused to ask a dermatologist. Nobody paused to ask why a man who was allegedly ashamed of his race would spend millions defending black artists, funding black hospitals, and crediting black musicians as the foundation of everything he built. The narrative was simply too entertaining to interrupt with facts. By the time serious journalists did start reporting the vitiligo diagnosis accurately, sometime in the mid-1990s, the damage had already calcified. Corrections rarely travel as far as the original story. The joke had a decade's head start, and it never really lost that lead. The slow isolation. This is where the story connects to something bigger than a skin condition. The vitiligo didn't just change how Michael looked. It changed how he lived. People who worked closely with him during the 1990s and 2000s describe a growing obsession with control. Control over lighting during performances, control over who could get close enough to see him without makeup, control over camera angles at public events. Every appearance became a production designed around hiding a disease the world still didn't fully believe was real. That constant management took a toll. Some biographers argue that the endless effort to maintain a flawless public image, layered on top of years of being mocked for something medical and involuntary, deepened the isolation that defined his later life. It's the same isolation that would eventually surround him at Neverland, the same retreat from public scrutiny that made him increasingly reliant on a small circle of doctors, aides, and handlers who controlled nearly every aspect of his daily life. And in a strange, tragic parallel to another chapter of his story, entirely different doctors and entirely different medications, the pattern repeats. A private medical reality, a public unwilling to accept it, and a man left to manage the gap between the two, almost entirely alone. The autopsy that confirmed everything. Here is the part of the story that finally, permanently ended the debate, but only after it was too late for Michael to hear it. When Michael Jackson died in June 2009, his official autopsy report confirmed what he had been saying publicly since 1993. He had vitiligo. The condition had progressed significantly over the decades, leaving large areas of his body without natural pigmentation. The report also noted lupus, another autoimmune condition that had contributed to his sensitivity to sunlight, and his reliance on heavy clothing and makeup, even off camera. In other words, every joke, every headline, every comedian's punchline about a man who supposedly hated his own race enough to bleach his skin white, all of it was built on a foundation that medical science had already disproven while he was still alive to hear the accusations. Dr. Klein spoke publicly after Michael's death, confirming again that the pigmentation loss had been real, progressive, and completely outside of Michael's control. He described a man who used makeup not out of vanity, but out of necessity, simply trying to appear consistent enough to walk on stage in front of the fans who loved him. By then, of course, the apology never really came. Culture had moved on to new headlines. The joke had already done its damage, embedded so deeply into how the public remembered him that even decades later, references to Michael Jackson turning himself white still surface in casual conversation, completely detached from the medical reality that ended the debate back in 2009. The fans who never stopped believing him, not everyone bought the rumor. Buried underneath decades of headlines, there was always a quieter group, fans, close friends, and fellow artists, who took Michael at his word the moment he explained it on television in 1993. Quincy Jones, who produced some of his biggest albums, spoke about him for years as a man dealing with a real illness, not a man in denial about his race. Family members, including his sister LaToya, publicly defended the diagnosis long before the autopsy made it undeniable. Fans who followed his career closely noticed the visible progression in old concert footage, patches spreading year over year in a pattern that no deliberate bleaching regimen would ever produce. But belief from the people closest to him was never going to compete with the reach of a national tabloid headline. Their voices existed, but they were consistently drowned out by louder, funnier, more shareable versions of the story. It's a familiar problem for anyone who has ever tried to correct a rumor after it has already become entertainment. The truth doesn't need to be wrong to lose. It just needs to be less exciting than the lie. Who was to blame? So who's responsible for turning a documented autoimmune condition into one of the most persistent celebrity myths in history? Some point directly at the tabloid press of the 1980s and 90s, an era with almost no regulation around medical speculation, where selling magazines mattered more than verifying a diagnosis. Publications ran cover after cover implying deliberate transformation, long after doctors close to Michael had already described the condition in general terms. Others point to the culture of celebrity gossip itself, an ecosystem that rewarded mockery over nuance, punchlines over patience. It was simply easier and funnier to joke about a star changing his race than to sit with the more complicated, more human explanation of a disease nobody could see coming and nobody could stop. Michael himself rarely fought back publicly after the Oprah interview. Those close to him say he grew tired of explaining something that should never have needed defending in the first place. He let the music speak instead, continuing to perform, continuing to create, even as the whispers followed him onto every stage he stepped onto for the rest of his life. Closing. There's a detail that makes this story sting even more in hindsight. Michael Jackson spent the final 2 decades of his life being ridiculed for a disease that had already been named, described, and explained by his own doctors, years before he died. The proof existed the entire time. The world simply chose the joke instead. We'll never know how differently his story might have been told if the culture around him in the 1980s had treated a medical diagnosis as a medical diagnosis, instead of turning it into decades of punchlines. A single moment of belief, one round of headlines that got it right instead of getting it viral, might have spared him one more layer of the isolation that defined his final years. So what do you think? Did the world owe Michael Jackson an apology it never gave him? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories behind the man behind the legend, hit subscribe, because there is a lot more still coming.